It's a real honor to have an opportunity to be here and share the work that we've been doing in the Third Ward. One of the challenges, as you might know, of community work is that you get many people with many different perspectives in a room trying to do something together. And it's almost like being at the UN, where people have all kinds of different languages and all kinds of different values and priorities, and it makes it a real challenge to accomplish anything. But one of the most rewarding aspects of this work is witnessing the process of people coming together with a shared vision and beginning the process of moving forward. And what I'd like to share with you this morning are some of the methods and reflections and observations of how we accomplish that work. More importantly, what I'd like to share is the fact that it is indeed an effort that's interdisciplinary. When I graduated architecture school and worked in corporate architecture, it took me about a year to figure out that that's not what I wanted to do. I did one too many stairwell details for administration buildings in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and said no. But I was really interested in what was it like to be a young Saudi going to learn about business from the perspective of the Harvard Business School. What in the world would that be like? And what would that person's perspective be? And what kind of place would you want to make for people who are coming from one culture to learn how to maneuver and participate in another culture? And that fact has always fascinated me and has drawn me to other disciplines and to work with other disciplines throughout my career. I will remind you that our country, as you all know, many of you are historians, is really new as things go. So as city building goes, we're real new. And as city building goes in Texas, we're real new. So we have an opportunity to do some things that other places haven't done. And we have an opportunity to learn from places and learn from people in ways that are really fantastic. The location that we're focused on is centered around this park, Emancipation Park. And it was redeveloped recently, and it had been a location of one of the first public parks in the state of Texas. And it became a public park through an interesting set of circumstances that I'll describe as we go forward. Many of you, I'm sure, will be quite aware of this. But the redevelopment of the park and the reinvestment of the park was the most significant reinvestment in this community in the past 50 years. And as you can see, this view that is being shown is looking basically southwest. So those high rises on the far left of the slide are the Texas Medical Center, are the beginnings of the Texas Medical Center. And those that are in the distance are towards the Galleria. So that's not downtown. Downtown is off to your right. You don't see downtown in this slide. But I did want to show a sense of the relationship of this slide from a drone's eye view. And Highway 59 is a highway that was built that separated this neighborhood from the rest of the city. One of the key locations in Emancipation Avenue is the park. It's shown in that illustration in green. I'm showing it not so much for the little dots of the locations because I'm going to show those on the slide, but that boundary that you see primarily illustrates how we began to think about what the district should be around the corridor itself. Emancipation Avenue runs basically from 45 on the north and south back towards, 59. And one of the things that was interesting about the corridor itself is that it was once called Dowling Street. And throughout the United States, particularly in the South, wherever there had been an African American community that was establishing itself post-slavery, and particularly where business people were and there was prominence, the leadership in that city at the time would make moves to reclaim that place. And this whole issue of claiming place was very important. And so they named the street after Dick Dowling, who was a Civil War officer, decorated Civil War officer. So it's kind of a poke in the eye. You say, you may be doing well, but we're still in charge, was really what that was all about. And that was going on all around the country. And I used to think, boy, that's petty, but given some of the political things that happened yesterday, I now see that, no, it wasn't all that petty at all. At least they had a purpose at it. There were a number of major buildings that were developed along that corridor during the period of time that the African American community was prospering. And that prosperity was due in part because of segregation and Jim Crow laws. That is, because you had limited options of where you could go to shop, the shopkeeper in the African American community had a well-defined market. And so those individuals could do very well. And if those individuals shared the same faith or race in this case, they could come together and build fairly significant edifices that represented their culture. In this case, on the right, St. John's Missionary Baptist Church is a marvelous example of the kind of aspiration of architectural display. It was not designed by an African American architect. Some of the buildings were, but this one, they went out and said, who is the best church architect that we can find that would symbolize our aspirations and our values? And so these two churches are representative of what was built in the Third Ward, particularly along Emancipation Avenue. Other kinds of things on the street are related to commerce and entertainment. The El Dorado Ballroom, which many of you may know of, was a famous venue for artists throughout the 30s and 40s and into the early 50s and right into the 60s, and it's now been slightly renovated and being prepared to be renovated again by Project Row Houses to have it be a contemporary venue. There's a ballroom dance studio that goes on there on Sunday afternoon, so if you want to get your ballroom dance on, you can go there. There are weddings and that sort of thing that are being used there. And Wolf's Pawn Shop, if you like hats, if you like Kango hats, if you like pork pie hats, that place is the coolest place in town. You can get some of the most interesting fashions there that are representative of African American male culture in anywhere in Houston. But more importantly, it was a pawn shop. And not a pawn shop as we think about it, where someone is down on their luck and they've got to pawn something or someone's stolen something and they want to fence it. But it was in fact a financial institution during the 50s where the owner of that place knew all the people in the community and would essentially do relationship lending through that pawn shop. And the item itself that was given was not so much for its value as much as it was as a token, as a representation, as a promise that I'm going to come back and give you the money that you have lent me. And that kind of notion of a financial institution and how that worked was something that was part of many other forms of financial management that went on in the community and in African American communities across the country. This presentation, I could have a whole nother hour just to talk about that issue alone. But I wanted to use that slide to be representative of that. Two other aspects again, these are recent slides, and these buildings have been here for a while. One is the Progressive Amateur Boxing Association, and many prominent boxers trained here. And it's one of the, if you want to hang out with the pugilists, and when I say pugilists, I mean in a real sense, those people who like boxing and really like physical fitness and fitness, they are there. And they're working around outside. You can see them. They're pushing big tires around, and it's part of a culture that is not the sleek Peloton cool workout environment. It's a much more gritty kind of regular place where you're a lot of regular people hanging out who just really happen to be into physical fitness, and that as a cultural icon is there. Delia's Lounge used to be a nightclub, it's now a laundromat for Rural CDC, but we wanted to keep the building because it's part of the fabric. And one of the challenges on Emancipation Avenue, as architects, we look and say, how am I going to design anything here? How do I coordinate with this? It really challenges you to think about incremental design in the context of redevelopment. And as a development consultant, one of the challenges that we'll be facing on this project is how to balance these forces between kind of large-scale projects that make your financials work versus an incremental design approach which really can integrate more natively with the community. And that's one of the things that we're struggling with. The Doshi House is now undergoing renovation, and I'll talk a little bit about that and more. The gable roofs that you see in the background there above it are not part of the building. That's a building in the background that was built by the Rice Design Workshop, and we're looking at renovating, possibly renovating that for a food hall. But Doshi is now going to be renovating his shop, and it sits on the corner of Holman and Emancipation Avenue. Another important building in the area is Imperial Clothing and Etta's Lounge, a kitchen. Etta is never open when you expect her to be. Etta is the mother of the proprietor, Shakti Baum. And she decided to name it after her mother because of the way her mother cooked and the way her mother entertained. And she's running it on that model. It's open for brunch on Sundays, and then she caters venues in the restaurant. It was a restaurant in Jamaica Plain in Boston called 9 Tables. That's all they had, 9 tables. And you had to get a reservation, you go in there, 9 tables, they serve the 9 tables, and boom, that's it. Well, in Etta's Kitchen, many of our community meetings, breakfast meetings and dinner meetings and lunches were held here. And she catered it. So she creates a home-like setting. She can serve up to 30 people or so. And you come in her storefront, and it's not the red windows, but it's the ones to the right of that entry. The owner of the building lives upstairs in an apartment, so it was renovated, and that whole model of a downstairs commercial use, the owner of the Imperial Clothing designs his own stuff, t-shirts and whatnot, and it's a very eclectic kind of locally attached businesses. That neither one of them are making a lot of money. But they really enjoy their work, and it really makes it a unique and special place. D-Bar. D-Bar, the bar. I debated whether to include a photograph of the people outside or not. If you can notice a little railing in the front, and at the cocktail hour, it's full of people standing there having drinks, and it's right on the street. The reason I included it is I really like the fact that it made this statement in the single architecture of being open and closed. There's a transparent part of the bar, and there's a closed part of the bar. And don't ask what goes on in either side unless you really know what's going on. Navy Seafood is another kind of an example of taking an architectural form, the kind of, this could have been built as a Jack in the Box or an old school Burger King or something like that, or a Dairy Queen. And then a private local business person took it, appropriated it, and now it's Navy Seafood. And yet it maintained this kind of air of a franchised thing, when in fact it's not. So it took the franchise, it gave it some value, and it restated it. How does that inform architecture is one of the things that we're thinking about deeply in our work. The Dowling office building was an informal way of informing the House of Tiny Treasures child care facility, which is in the block right next to it. And those series of blocks for the child care, the proportions of that were taken from the Dowling office building, and the whole thing sits around a courtyard, and it's one of the most wonderful places that I've ever been in. But architecturally, it's very played down, it's kind of neutral, it's not trying to shout at itself, and it's being very deferential to its neighbor, which isn't what I'd call an architectural gem, but you know, it's there, it's solid, it's kind of a pair of Oxfords kind of building. I wanted to end this series about the architecture with two projects that are near and dear and close to my heart. Most of you are familiar with Project Row Houses. These buildings on the left had been abandoned. They were shooting galleries where people shoot up. There was prostitution going on. There's all kinds of problems in these houses, and a group of artists led by Rick Lowe occupied them, got the city to give them and redevelop them and turned them into a combination of visiting art galleries and a temporary housing program for young mothers. And I won't, again, get into that program, but it's an institution in the community now. And it celebrated this form of housing, which was really, really slave housing when it was originally imagined. And shotgun typology, for anyone who's studied architecture, and particularly historic American architecture, is really aware of this. The dog trot house is another. It has been reappropriated through Project Row Houses, and over time has begun to take on a whole series of new meanings. And we're using that typology to really, again, think more deeply about how we approach redevelopment in the community from the community's point of view. The building on the right, Riverside General Hospital, we're showing not the historic version of this. They have another building that's a very nice neoclassical building that used to be a nurse's residence. This building is kind of, it's the kind of building that gets torn down in Houston all the time. And what is being proposed is that it be kept for the redevelopment of the hospital. It's going to be, the county has acquired it with the help of Houston Endowment, and it is currently abandoned. It was a private hospital. It used to be the Negro Hospital in Houston, and now it will be a focus on behavioral health. And it will serve both the region and the community, but they're also thinking how it supports the surrounding area and what are the strategies for making this work in the community. One of the exhibits at Project Row Houses was really wonderful. One of the artists came up with this idea when we were doing if you know Project Row Houses, they do rounds, and each of the houses has different exhibits. And this round was focused on redevelopment in the third ward, and this particular house was focused on gentrification. And the artists used the theme of monopoly throughout the house. And I just thought it was a fascinating way of bringing residents into the idea of what gentrification was all about. And so all around the exhibit, it focused on that issue. But I present this at this point to talk a little bit about how we're organized to do the work. Many of you may not be planners, and so if you are not interested in organizational development or whatnot, get out your cell phone and play your game or do something. Because I'm going to go through a few minutes of what in my earlier days as an architect would find extremely boring, and in this stage of my life I find it extremely important. And it's probably the most important part of my work. And I probably put more time in this aspect of the work than any of the time that I do around design and planning and research and that sort of thing, research around statistical analysis. The area that we're focused on is in blue. And this is an area that was developed for focus by a group of students at MIT in work with the Emancipation Economic Development Council about 3 or 4 years ago. And the green area in this map focuses on the land that has been acquired both by the Midtown Redevelopment Authority, a state legislator, Garnett Coleman, was very insightful in his strategy to acquire land in the Third Ward when it was cheap. And then the other parcels within that green area are owned by nonprofits and churches. So even though the Third Ward is the most intensely pressured area around, with displacement pressure on it, the insight by circumstance and by plan of both the government through Garnett Coleman and the public sector and the nonprofit sector through churches and nonprofits have acquired enough land in the area to satisfy the need for affordable housing in the area. There is no need for anyone to be displaced in this community if we get it right, and if we work together and we collaborate. And it's a model that can be shared with many other communities. I'm going to talk a little bit later in this, and then you're going to have some other sessions on gentrification, that we have gotten the tools together with statistical analysis and geographic information systems and all the like to really begin to get to a point where we can predict neighborhoods that will be gentrified. Even there are typologies of gentrification that exist. And today I'm going to talk about one typology that deals with one place or one economic circumstance and one set of cultural circumstances. The Northern Third Ward developed a series of values, and the work that the MIT students did with the EEDC developed some vision statements. And the vision statement itself was very powerful: to have a resilient, dynamic, and economically prosperous community where people live, work, and thrive in a historically and culturally rich African American neighborhood. So what they're saying is, we don't mind other people being in this community, we just want to be here. And we want to not just physically be here, but culturally be here and have a cultural presence here. Bastrop would not be Bastrop if a bunch of folks from France decided that Bastrop was a great place to be and everybody just started speaking French. It just wouldn't be the same place. Not to say that the people in Bastrop wouldn't welcome the French speakers, but they wouldn't want the culture of Bastrop to change. It's a very unique place, and it has a history that needs to be honored, and it can bear the burdens of growth and change without losing its uniqueness. The values that they heard: they want to keep the existing residents. They want to provide a functional organizational body that could actually coordinate this, because they understood that individual organizations operating in their silos, doing their separate projects, won't get the job done, because too much of the pressure of gentrification is time sensitive. Too much of it is market driven, and there needs to be coordination. The Emancipation Community Development Partnership came to be after this work was done and was recognized that this community group had really gone a long way to do some interesting things. So the Kinder Foundation, the Houston Endowment, got with Project Row Houses and the EEDC to collaboratively enter into a redevelopment process for the community. I was hired through that process. Originally, I responded as a consultant, and they said, no, we want you in the community. You've got to work for Project Row Houses and we're going to make it a program of Project Row Houses, and we're going to do that for 2 years. And we're going to transition out of that. But they felt that any consultancy needed to be rooted in the community, and that any consultants who come in need to be managed by someone who knew their world, knew their language, which I kind of know, and yet be directly accountable to the people who would walk into my office every day. I mean, literally, people would walk into my office every day and ask me about what was going on, because I was working in one of those little shopping houses that you saw. And that experience grounded me in a way that would never have happened had I been working at home or in an office downtown or in another city. And I got a level of information, a level of understanding about the community that being embedded, if you will, was critical. The roles that were important to be played were financing, who comes up with the money and coordination, management and stakeholder communications. How do you make sure that all of the key stakeholders are talking with each other and listening to each other? A big part of my job. And then how is all of this managed? That's another big part of my job. Who are the people that need to be doing what, when, where, and how? That work led to a comprehensive community development strategy that focused on affordable housing, community economic development, public policy development, arts-based community development, and I'll talk about that a little later. It's an interesting thing. I tried to give a sense of it in this presentation. It's an ephemeral thing about art and what the artist does and how we receive art in the community and how do we receive it individually and collectively. I've worked on public arts programs before, and I had a big problem with what I used to call plop art, where you get an artist and you do a piece and you plop it down in some place that you design, and it just always bothered me. But Project Row Houses is really committed to this notion that creativity is part of the human experience in our daily lives. And how do we engage those who have committed their daily activity to this human experience, the artists, in such a way that they are embedded, if you will, with the community so that the work that they produce no longer becomes plop art. So it's a two-way thing. How to create a context for the artist and how to create a context for the work and how to do it in a context for the viewer that makes sense. And how that happens, I could not write about it. I've been asked to write about it. Rick Lowe has kind of done some stuff about it over the years, but it's really an experiential thing. And hopefully one day somebody smart enough and intelligent enough will be able to write it and other people can follow it. But right now all I can say is you got to be there and you got to do it in order to really get it. The other part of this was creating an empowerment framework. What the hell does that mean? I never believe that you can empower anybody. I just don't buy that. So what I can believe is that you can create a framework for people to empower themselves. So we think about community organizing, which includes education and training in order to do what you need to do, and advocacy and political strategic action. We think about resources that need to be identified and resources that need to be deployed in order to develop anything in the community. And then you got to look at what you've done. You've got to be able to assess what you need and determine whether you have the capacity to actually do what you say you want to do. And creating that rigorous structure and getting everyone to kind of work in that structure allows them to see their work in relationship to others. And that's one of the big things that we did. And it's one of the things that we continually do, because this is a process that is never ending, if you will, but it's critically important. I looked around for a case study in the country, and by chance, Dr. Asada Richards, who's over the EEDC, she's the director, also looked at the same thing with the Detroit's People platform. Now they're socialists, but they also are really good organizers. And as organizers, it's a funny thing in this country, and I'm struggling with it, so I don't want to get too political, but I'm going to be personal. I think that we benefit from an economic system that has generated more benefit and wealth and health for people around the planet beyond anything that man has ever seen. And we are at a point where we have to organize ourselves to make sure that all of us benefit from that productivity. And so organizing is key in order to do that. One person or one small group of people just can't do it. One person and one small group of people can produce wealth. There's no question about that. But to have an environment in which you don't feel like you have to have a wall around your home in order to feel safe, and that you don't feel like you have to put barriers between you and others in order to feel healthy, requires organizing. And I don't know any other way to do it. I'm a Christian, Jesus did it, Matter of fact, I think Paul was the first network marketer, you know, in terms of what he was doing around the region of the Mediterranean. You know, they took advantage of the trade routes, but it was always open. And I have this on a timer, so that's why I'm clipping forward. But I felt I need to back up because it's really important. I want to take more time on this, and I didn't edit my timer. These three things, community organizing, community-based development, and community-based service provision, have activities. And these activities can be done by a variety of people in different ways as long as they're talking to each other. So I cannot stress these three areas of activity. I cannot stress these groups of activity within them and having a sense that they need to be done in order to actually empower anybody. And the organizing, the building, and the sustaining are the three areas that are key. Planning and observing is what we did initially. We are now in the deploying and applying mode, and we are also doing that in a way where we can serve and learn. And the work of evaluations are very much a part of that work. And then, how do we think about management structure? And again, this is the sneeze, snores, go to sleep portion. When I took my management courses, I didn't want to do this. But understanding that governance with organizing, building, and sustaining in a hierarchical form is one approach, and then doing it in a collaborative form is another. And we are experimenting with this collaborative form in the context of our community. And every community would have a different way of dealing with that. The EEDC itself has a slew of committees, more committees than you can imagine. And one of the committees that's relevant for what we're talking about today is the Emancipation Avenue Main Streets Committee. And one of the challenges that we had was, how do you look at this issue of economic development? There's so many aspects of it when you talk about community economic development. And said, the Main Streets program, that does it. And it deals with culture, and it deals with people, and it's place-based. And man, it was not a hard sell at all. Everyone just jumped right on board and embraced it, and got full steam ahead about using the Main Streets program as an organizing framework around which the community could focus on the economic development component of its work. The EEDC began to rethink how its committees were aligned with the Main Streets program. So you had organization, which is one of the Main Streets program's principles, promotion, design, and economic vitality. And we began to think about which of the committees have principal tasks that fit within these various activities. And just to make sure that we're efficient, always give them a gut check as if they're doing this work that their committee is doing, is it in these areas? And if it's not, it ought not be a high priority. And if it is, it ought to be a high priority. How does that relate to the context in which we were working? I wanted to get into the history. I had another 50 slides that went with this, and I dumped them. And I tried to do just a few slides with the assumption that I'm dealing with an audience that knows a lot about some of this stuff. But I wanted to put it in the context of gentrification. As you all know, the Emancipation period was not a day. It was a spectrum of time with different people. It was an organizing activity, but it did have a time, and in Texas that time was a little later than other places. But that event of ending chattel slavery, and I make the point of chattel slavery versus other forms of slavery. That is, generations of people who are bred and raised to serve the needs and economic interests of others to their own detriment. Group of people, generations, bred and raised to serve the interest of others to their own detriment. That's what chattel slavery was. And that system for 300 years, man, that's a long time. ended fairly abruptly. And you had in Georgia, people marching, following Sherman. Sherman got so tired, man, we got to do something with all these folk following us. Let's give them land. 40 acres and a mule. Put them all the way on the coast. That'd be great. Get them out of my hair. Reintegrate them in another way. Because the way they were integrated before was not just. It was not humane. It was not civil. It did not represent the values that this country purported. So most people in the country said, hey, we need to change that. But at the end of the day, economics and culture are so intricately related that Reconstruction as a project failed. And reactions to Reconstruction rose out of the Jim Crow laws, such that at a high point in the 20s, the KKK had a national march on Washington. And that representation of reaction to change affects us and afflicts us today. How do we deal with that in the community development framework where people of goodwill want to have a conversation, but nobody wants to be a victim and nobody wants to be a perpetrator? How do you work that out in the context of, say, gentrification? The civil rights movement kind of began to push back at Jim Crow laws. And all of that informed gentrification in inner city African American communities in a unique way. Gentrification is not unique to the African American community. It's not unique in the United States. You can find gentrification in Greece, you can find it in Italy, it's everywhere. It's an economic question in large measure, but a brilliant woman in England laid over the social framework of this. And it's a social aspect of it that I wanted to focus on in this presentation, not so much the economic aspect. And it's the social aspect that's unique, and it's the social aspect that you have to understand if you want to be effective in any given place, in any given time, in order to effectuate change. In the African American community, because the 50s was a high point of economic and social development because of the isolation. And then concurrent to that, desegregation and disinvestment, and I won't go through all that litany, occurred concurrently to produce areas that could be gentrified. That is, areas that were devalued, whose values were now being reclaimed because these locations were all great. You know, if you lived in River Oaks and you didn't want your maid to take forever to get here, the Third Ward was a great location for that maid to live, to be able to get on the bus and get over to your neighborhood, and that was great. So all of these neighborhoods are pretty well located. And so today they are very valuable as places that have a unique cultural framework. So gentrification in the inner city African American community has its roots in things other than economics. It includes economics and it is part of a larger framework, but it's also a social framework that we have to understand if we're going to be effective in dealing with it. So that as planners, historians, architects, sociologists, archaeologists, we can begin looking at communities. An archaeologist working in the Third Ward will interpret those artifacts different than that archaeologist working in Butte, Montana. And there may be similar artifacts, but the social framework around it is going to be different. And how that affects gentrification, and there is gentrification in Butte, has been when the copper mine, before the copper mine closed, there was people getting forced out. Those kinds of things are relevant. The slave population, again, I'd like to get specific where things were occurring, and in terms of Fort Bend, the Brazoria, Matagorda, and Wharton counties, those areas had really, really high populations. I have another series of maps, and I looked at it, and oh yeah, that's a river delta. And if you looked at all the rivers going through here, that's some of the most fertile land. I had a debate not a debate, one of my good friends from college. And we loved each other politically. We had different politics. He was on Reagan's fundraising campaign. and we debate, but we loved each other, and we knew we both loved the country, and so there was never any animosity about it. It's just we had different opinions. And I talked to him recently, and he's a Trump supporter. And I said, why? He says, well, we want to make America great again. I said, you mean using stolen land and stolen labor? And he goes, what do you mean? What are you talking about? And I said, no, I'm not trying to, debate about different things. I just want us to talk about the same thing. And when you talk about it, you're looking at one thing. When I talk about it, I'm looking at another. So I'm still looking for my 40 acres and a mule plus interest. So I'm not mad at you. I just want us to have a similar conversation. We can disagree. It's okay. But I think from a point of view of public policy and the work that we do in communities, having a clear understanding of where people's wealth is and is not will help us figure out how to go forward. I was fortunate. My father was very successful, so I was able to go to college. He paid for college. We had a bank account, and he had enough money when he died. I had money that I inherited that I in then turn put in an account for my kids to inherit, right? Well, he was the first one to do that in my family. Well, my best friend, that was going on since 1700. So, compound interest matters. And so just at a family level, you can look at these things and just, you don't have to debate about it. It's just, that's what it is. Now, how do we move forward in a way that respects what's needed? This reality of the populations was really important. How did Jim Crow get going? It was a set of laws, but it's also a cultural phenomenon. It was also a signage and symbology that went on that reinforced the notion that others were less than. It was very, very deep. And I think that it's one thing if you see that sign and you're not a dog, a Negro, or Mexican. But if you are a dog who can happen to read, and a Negro or a Mexican, that sign affects you different. And it affects you at a meta-psychological way that, as a country, we have yet to reconcile. And if we're going to be successful in recognizing and dealing with these issues and we want to be part of the solution, we've got to begin to understand this. The Juneteenth celebrations started right here in Austin in 1900. There were others. There were great papers. Working at the Smithsonian has gotten me really into artifacts and photographs and stuff, so I try and make sure I have them there. And in Houston, Jack Yates was part of a group of men, recently freed slaves, who got it together and put money together to build one of the first parks in the state of Texas. They acquired the land for it. The people who benefited from that are, in 1915, these are people who were considered themselves survivors of slavery. And not a few Harris County survivors of antebellum days, which is kind of a, what? What in the world is them days, antebellum days? It's a different thing, man. It was slavery, gosh, call it what it is. So we, as historians, as curators of museums and whatnot, you all have this job of kind of going around and de-whitewashing the language and things that have been said so that we really kind of understand what it is. Not to hate on anybody, not to, again, argue victims and perpetrators, but to be clear. When I read that quote and I see those people and I knew what's going on, antebellum days just doesn't fit. But somebody consciously wrote that to make a point. I don't know what point it was, but it certainly undermined the atrocity that was slavery. In the high point, and I focused on this work by John Biggers. He did this mural in 1953. That's when it was completed, the year I was born. And it's a fantastic statement, and I contrast it with that photograph because it looks at the sweep of African life and how people survived. And this is where artists come in, right? I could get this information out of a history book, and I personally like history. I'm one of the few weird kids when I was in ninth grade that liked Barbara Tuchman. Who is Barbara Tuchman, man? Oh man, she's great, man. You got to read that woman. But the notion of Barbara Tuchman's storytelling interpreted in painting and the power of that is something that we've been looking at and that Project Row Houses is all about. And this mural, which was part of a mural that John Biggers did in the Blue Triangle, was damaged during Hurricane Harvey. And there was a real struggle, and successfully that mural has been saved. But the women who were depicted as part of this lineage were the leaders in actually saving it. And I wanted to make that point that we can't do anything for anybody that they can't do for themselves. We just need to get out of the way, be a part of it, be supportive, and folk will shine. Folk will do just quite well, and be able to sustain those things. This is another painting that John Biggers did of row houses in the Third Ward, and it looked like he took it from Holman Street. And the reason I like this is it was a good framework in a kind of a poetic way. It helped me think about a definition of gentrification, because there are a number of definitions, and I'll share one with you in a minute that's different from this. But in the case of the Third Ward, and you can put this definition slightly different in other neighborhoods. It's a situation where one set of people and culture are being displaced for another more economically able set of people and culture. That's one way to define it. There are others, but in the context of the work that we're doing, this is how we're defining it. We took a close look at a lot of the statistics in the community and what trends were going on that impacted that, and I'm not going to stay too focused on that. We looked at market conditions, so we got a lot of the standard planner stuff, but we were looking at trends. And the Kinder Institute just came out just recently with a report that talked about gentrification with a different definition. Not to knock on them, but they were looking at the whole city, and they were looking at it in a different way. But they were noting the acceleration of it. The gray areas were areas that were impacted by gentrification, and the blue areas are various levels of accelerant that go on. They did a typology and a timeline of the typology of gentrification throughout the community. So we have some tools now that we didn't have 10 years ago that allow us to really understand the economic forces and the patterns such that we can actually get ahead of this thing or get in the middle of this thing and have effective interventions based on data, based on what we know. They've developed the gentrification typology of the city. They've developed a susceptibility index, what communities might be impacted. And this is not just for issues of race, but for issues of economics. When you look at it from the point of view, and these are some of the strategies that you can use, when you look at it and overlay it from the point of view of race, there's some interesting patterns that come up and that become revealed. In the slide on the left, red is where white folks are. And the deeper the red, the more Anglo it is. And on the right is where African Americans are. And the deeper the red, the greater the populations. This is aggregated at the census data level. So just kind of how people are making choices, why are they there, where are the economics, boom, boom, boom. So we're looking at that. I go back to this painting. Again, I look at the data, and then I look at the impression and the art. And in this instance, the first time I looked at this painting, I didn't really catch it, but that church is on fire. And people are watching it, and the old man is holding a lantern, which is symbolic of time in the culture, right, in the dark. And are we going to get out of this? And boy, I said, man, this is just a lot. And the more I looked at the painting, the more I saw an analysis, the data that we look at as planners being interpreted in art in a way that I can take it in and get a different feel and a different understanding of it. Going back to the kind of a typical thing planners do, we tried to understand the Emancipation Avenue in the context of a corridor. We wanted to understand it in the context of a slightly larger corridor. The Houston Southeast Management District is a management district that we're working with, and they have a larger area that they're dealing with, which is Greater Third Ward, and they have a number of economic corridors that they're looking at, and ours is a principal one. So we want to understand how we related into that fabric. We also did some fairly sophisticated GIS-based mapping and analysis to begin to understand suitability analysis for development. I used to work in real estate investment, and so a lot of the principles that we use in real estate investment were applied here, and just said, how do you begin to think about this as an economic entity, and where is the value, and how do you capture that value for the benefit of the community? Well, you have to understand where the value flows are, where they're going, and then who can leverage that to what end. What are some of the tools? We work very closely with the city through their Walkable Places initiative. And somebody told me it was really great. The planners from the city came out and they were all happy. You know, we got the planning commission there ready to do a Walkable Places thing, and blah, 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 blah. And here, you're going to be able to walk to this nice cafe. And one lady stood up, she said, well, look, for me, Walkable Places is my ability to be able to walk from my house to go pick up my kid from school, or to walk from my house to go shopping. Now, how does this relate to that? Totally changed the conversation, right? But it's not that they didn't understand it, it was a dialogue that happened in such a way that improved the overall process of the work that we've been doing. So the city went back and they began to look more closely at things like the variances that were being pulled in the neighborhood for lands, because these are indicators of gentrification and where the development opportunity is going to happen and how do we exploit them for the goals that you have. And we identified these focus areas, which happen to be the same focus areas that we have for redevelopment along Emancipation Avenue, which happen to be, one is Trinity East Village, where we're looking at now. We developed a partnership with the church and with the NHP Foundation, which is a development group out of DC, and they're going to be doing about 300 units of housing, well, 250 right now, 125 of family, 125 of elderly, in a kind of a village setting. Emancipation Avenue is this bluish-green line that goes north-south or vertically on the map. The second area is the Emancipation Center. I got here a little late yesterday because we had our groundbreaking for this on yesterday morning, and this building, or proposed building, symbolizes one of the challenges that we face. This idea of a building that has a mixed-use office, the idea of the management district is to have an operations center for affordable housing. Okay, it's a government response. And we're going to put everybody who's doing affordable housing into this building, and we're going to work together, and it's a symbol. Okay, I think it's a good symbol, but you know, I know it doesn't get the job done if we don't do everything else. But and then those are the 20 units of housing that they're building right behind it in their first phase. Project Row Houses and the Doshi House are working together on an incremental scale development. Much smaller scale. The sheds that, let's see if this laser pointer works. No better, sorry. Those sheds are there. The row houses that were, I showed in the photograph, are in the right corner of that model. And the new duplex townhouses are being interspersed on the upper left, and we're building two-story buildings similar to the one that I shared with you about the Edda's Kitchen, that kind of scale building, mixed use. 2 or 3 commercial units on the ground floor, housing above. The potential development is really important to understand. And we really took some time in analyzing a lot of factors to get an idea that that dark blue area are the areas where development is most likely to happen. And how do we either influence that development or do that development ourselves is the challenge that we face. It's a challenge that creates this tale of two cities, the Third Ward in Houston. As you remember the earlier slide, I was looking off to the southwest where you saw the medical center and the Galleria area and whatnot, for those of you who know Houston. That's downtown. And that's how close it is. And this question of how you manage scale, the Midtown proposal that I shared with you is an intermediate version of it. For those of you who've been to Midtown, it's more of that. And the incremental development is a much different kind of a deal. It's different players. The larger development, that's going to be done by institutional investors. People like I used to work for John Hancock Real Estate Investment Group. So my friends in that arena are the ones who pull those bond deals together, who pull the tax credit deals together. They make that kind of stuff happen. Not bad. Good stuff. But there are other folk in the community who have saved their money. There are a lot of people who are sitting around who have been teachers or they've had small businesses, and they got $100,000 in the bank somewhere. And they're willing to invest in the neighborhood and do a small scale development if they could get in. And how do you get them in? And they can say, that's my building. And they're going to take a different kind of pride. And we see that over cities all the time. And so part of the challenge is, how do you engage the local residents who have means or who are aspiring to means in such a way that you don't block them out and still allow that institutional development to occur in a way that nurtures the culture? When I was working at John Hancock and I was doing a project in Denver, I really didn't know the culture in Denver. I was looking at the pro forma, I'd come flying in, I'd look at the project, oh yeah, it looks good, the numbers look, oh, that's a nice building, oh, the architecture is great, this is good, Lodo, and then I'm out, and just not connected. And so it's not that it's bad, it's just a different thing. And the thing that really makes cities work and that really make them thrive and that really make them places where we want to be require that more intimate scale of activity as well. And so we're not saying one or the other, they're saying both. That the larger scale has a tendency to block out the latter, and in lots of different ways. And again, the purpose of this presentation was not to get into that. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you.